It's that time of year again where you might be thinking about jumping into an MMO like The Elder Scrolls Online, either as a new or a returning player. In this video, we'll answer the question of should you play ESO in 2025, because believe it or not, there are massive changes coming to the game this year that nobody really expected. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. HDM here, and I don't know how many thousands of hours played in ESO over the past 10 years, so that's why I was pretty surprised that ZeniMax Online Studios decided to really change things up this year when it came to content for ESO in 2025. This new release model for the game is definitely going to be one of the main factors for you to consider when you think about investing any time into this game, either as a new player or if you're thinking about returning after a break. So what is changing? Well, ESO is moving away from its previous model of releasing a new chapter expansion every year to a more seasonal approach to content. We don't know all the details yet, but we do know for sure that 2025 won't see a new big chapter release like we've seen in the past with expansions like Gold Road, Necrom, and so on. Here's what the studio director had to say about this in his most recent update. We have been incredibly successful with our strong annual chapter releases, starting with Morrowind in 2017 up through Gold Road just 6 months ago. Zone design and quest content is at the core of every Elder Scrolls game, as our annual chapter release model highlighted. We will still do lots of story content, but now, looking into 2025, we need to concentrate on different types of content to support all types of ESO players. So we're putting chapters aside and we'll be focusing on new types of content and a new release philosophy. As 2025 will be a transition year for new content, we are going to have new zone-based content launch in 2025, but you have to wait until April to hear the specifics about how it is different, so stay tuned. So what is that new type of content and new release philosophy, you might be asking? Well, the studio director summed that up as well, though we need to wait a few more months to get the full details. Basically, ESO will be moving to a seasonal style of content release in 2025 rather than the chapter expansion model that we had previously. Here's what he had to say about seasons. Over the course of 2025, we'll be moving more towards a seasonal content model and away from launching massive content updates once a year as we did with chapters. We will be talking much more about this in the future, but in 2025, expect to see named seasons of 3 or 6 months duration with a mix of themed story content, events, store items, dungeons, and more. 2025 will be a mix of old and new as we move the dev team towards creating smaller, bite-sized pieces of content. We still have some larger items that we've been working on for over a year, which you'll see launch as well. So in terms of new content, things are definitely changing up quite a bit for the Elder Scrolls Online in 2025, which may be a good thing, especially if you've played the game before and we're getting tired of the same old release schedule and the same old formula, which I know many players were. But what if you're completely new to ESO? What is there to do as a new player and where do you start? Well, this can get confusing, so let's talk about the price and DLC options next. In terms of the base cost for the game, The Elder Scrolls Online is not a free-to-play title and probably won't be for a little while longer, but one of its advantages in today's market is just how low the cost is to get started. Right now, I believe the base game of ESO is about $20, but you can often find it on sale for even cheaper. Either way, this is going to be a great deal for a beginner if you're just looking to get started in this MMO. That's because getting in on the ground floor and purchasing the base game of ESO unlocks literally hundreds of hours of content, including multiple adventure zones fans of the Elder Scrolls franchise will be familiar with, 4 powerful classes, amazing fully voice-acted quests and stories, solo content, group dungeons, 12-player trials, and even the new Infinite Archive Zone, which is procedurally generated for 1 to 2 players with basically infinite content. And I'll talk more about the value proposition of ESO in just a minute, but at that lowest level of just purchasing the base game, there's plenty here to keep you playing for hundreds of hours without even looking at DLC content. DLC does add many more layers to the experience of the Elder Scrolls Online, and it's still ridiculously cheap to get in 2025. Right now, ESO still has the Gold Road Collection version of the game, which includes 2024's expansion called Gold Road and all previous chapter expansions. This includes the Necrom expansion, for example, which added the Apocrypha Zone and the new Arcanist class, the Greymoor chapter, which expanded on the playable zone of Skyrim and added mythic items, the Elsewhere chapter, which added the playable Necromancer class, and tons more. Each of these expansions were originally priced at $40 at a minimum, so the fact that you can get 7 of these for just another $40 on top of the base game price is kind of insane. Now, to be fair, again, this is a lot of content, and there's probably no way you could finish it all in a year, but it is there for you to pick and choose from if you really want to, and again, I think it's a great deal, especially if you want to explore the end game in more detail, have access to all the classes, mythic items, jewelry crafting, and other mainline features. Of course, there's also the ESO Plus subscription for $15 a month, which gives you access to all of the other story zones as well as dungeon pack DLCs. The subscription also offers more value, such as a monthly allowance of the game's premium currency called crowns, faster experience progression, but to be honest, the biggest reason why most people end up keeping their ESO Plus subscription is for the limitless craft bag, where you can store as many crafting supplies as you want. This is honestly a huge time saver, and playing an endgame without it, especially if you want to craft for yourself or your friends, is going to be a challenge. That being said, you don't need to start with an ESO Plus subscription. In fact, I would recommend waiting a few months to see if you truly are invested enough in this game before picking that up, but just be aware that it does exist and it is a popular option for players who want to get the most out of the game consistently. Okay, so once you've decided on either jumping into the base game or the DLC chapters, what will you actually be doing? I think it's easiest to break down the content for ESO into solo content versus groups. And as a massive multiplayer online RPG, The Elder Scrolls Online does have a surprising amount of solo content. This is no doubt due to the game's place in the Elder Scrolls universe, which is dominated by the popular single-player titles like Skyrim, Oblivion, maybe the Elder Scrolls 6 someday. And looking at things from face value, ESO actually has the most solo content of any Elder Scrolls game in history, dwarfing previous titles with its amount of playable areas, including the zones of Morrowind, Cyrodiil, Skyrim, and a lot more, all included as part of ESO. Now, obviously, the scale is not the same, and you'll find more explorable content in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim versus ESO's versions of Skyrim, which covers multiple zones, but the fact remains that if you're looking for a new playable Elder Scrolls game, ESO is the only title currently doing that now, and has been consistently doing so for the last 10 years. So how is the solo content? Well, you can solo almost anything in ESO, including most of the main stories, world bosses, side quests, even some dungeons, which are quote group dungeons, can still be soloed if your build is strong enough. ESO even added the option for NPC companions a few years ago that help players solo even more content without a god tier build, which is great because with so many solo options, you never have to worry about waiting for your friends to log in before you can actually do something. You can run through pretty much all the zones in the game, completing all zone stories and side quests, speaking to every NPC, and they're all voice acted, and some of the quest chains are very entertaining. As mentioned, ESO even added the new Infinite Archive dungeon recently, which players can technically solo as much as they want as repeated content with increasing difficulty. However, outside of the Infinite Archive, which we mentioned, most content that's intended for solo gameplay, such as the Overland zones and story quests, is straight up easy mode and will never get more challenging regardless of your level. Soloing in the Elder Scrolls Online feels a lot like a story mode difficulty in other games, where most trash enemies only take a swing at you every few seconds, and your base health regeneration is usually more than enough to keep you alive if you were just to sit there AFK. Now, this may change in 2025, and I hope it does. Creating a more challenging Overland Zone experience was noted as something that the dev team wants to tackle this year, but when and how they will do that, we still don't know for sure. That said, if you're playing ESO solo, it's most likely not for the challenge, but instead for the story and the expansive world that you want to explore. As I said, ESO has dozens of zones at this point, many of which are huge and which will take several minutes to traverse from one end to the other. Most overland zones, of course, have major towns and settlements, as well as multiple mini dungeons called delves, public dungeons, which are a bit more difficult. But the crown jewel in experience in ESO for soloists and role players is the questing and the story content itself, which I mentioned, especially those fully voice acted NPCs and quest lines. There's also a lot of freedom in terms of where you can go and when. Since none of the overland zones are level capped, literally every section of Tamriel will be open to you from the start as long as you own the required DLC. In terms of rewards for adventuring solo, it's important to keep in mind that while you can play ESO like a single player Elder Scrolls game if you want, the game's overall reward and itemization structure is still very much like an MMO. For example, players in ESO can collect pieces of armor sets from any boss in the current zone, and these set pieces give stacking bonuses for equipping 2, 3, and 4 pieces, plus a unique 5-piece bonus, which is very MMO-ish for lack of a better term. But since overland content is not difficult at all, most of these overland set bonuses are not especially powerful, and if you think that by completing that epic 10-hour-long story quest, you'll get an impactful weapon or unique piece of armor like you did in Skyrim. Well, no, you'll most likely just get another basic 5-piece set item with maybe a different name. Nothing really that special. Now, this is something I would love to see ESO improve on in the future as well when it comes to solo and story content, so that the rewards that you earn match the amount of time a player puts in. To be fair, ESO is improving some of its reward structure, but generally speaking, the best weapons and armor still are going to be found by farming gear drops over and over in group dungeons and trials in true MMO fashion. But speaking of which, let's talk about group content next, where ESO shines even brighter in my opinion as we start getting into the more challenging and inspired content of the game. That includes 4-player dungeons and 12-player trials. Though you can group up in ESO at any time and for any content, it's the 4-player dungeon experience which has really shaped the game since its launch. ESO's dungeons are handcrafted, designed for groups of 4 players, and they're more than just combat challenges. They are narrative experiences as well that often tie into the larger storylines of the world. Each dungeon is unique and features distinct themes, enemy types, stories, and bosses. Some dungeons also include puzzles or secret rooms, hidden bosses, and treasures. So there's plenty of incentive to come back and repeat each dungeon. And unlike the overland and story content we mentioned earlier, dungeons and trials also have difficulty settings, multiple, different instances you can join, including normal, veteran, and even hard mode difficulty settings for some bosses. Now, this allows groups of ESO players to kind of customize their dungeon experience to better fit the group's experience level, while also improving the rewards that they get, which is a nice addition. Now, trials are ESO's version of raids, basically, designed for larger groups of 12 players, and these are the pinnacle of group content in ESO, offering the most challenging and complex encounters in the game, which sometimes can take groups months to master fully. And that's because trials are not just about fighting tougher enemies. They involve specific mechanics that require every member of the group to play their part effectively. This might include managing your position, handling specific bosses, adapting to these different changes during the fight. So there's a lot to learn from trials, and it takes a lot of coordination as well. But speaking of group roles, you might be interested to know that ESO lives by that tried and true holy trinity for MMOs, with players dedicating builds to damage dealing or DPS, healing, or tanking. Those are, the basic 3 roles that you can play in a group. Now, generally speaking, if you want an easier style of group play, a damage dealer is what I would recommend, though perfecting your rotation can be a bit challenging depending on your class. Healers and tank builds do tend to be a bit more challenging to play as they're more reactive and require knowledge of each dungeon or trial and specific bosses and mechanics to really be successful. But in terms of rewards for group content, because this is the most challenging in the game, you also tend to find the best rewards from these activities. Again, group dungeons and trials. This is going to include the best sets in the game with the best bonuses for your builds, monster sets from dungeons, which recreate the effects of bosses in that zone, and then trial sets, which have powerful offensive and defensive bonuses that you can't find anywhere else. Also, for the most part, group content has a large percentage of achievement-based rewards, such as unique skins, unique mounts, personalities, titles, and that's another reason why players really enjoy this type of content in the Elder Scrolls Online. But no matter what you do in ESO, one of the main things you'll be doing, of course, is combat, and this is, I find, to be one of the most debated topics when it comes to the Elder Scrolls Online and whether somebody, likes the game or not. For some context, ESO uses an action combat system similar to other MMOs like, let's say, New World, for example, and even Throne and Liberty, but without any tab targeting. So you're actively selecting targets and then doing basic attacks while also moving, blocking, dodging, and then casting all of your abilities. Now, I know this can be a lot for people to get comfortable with at the start, especially as most skills do not have cooldowns, meaning you can just cast whatever you want, whenever you want, as long as you have enough resources, either stamina or magicka. So part of this game, part of the combat system is actually sustaining those resources so you don't run out and you're still able to cast your abilities. But this is honestly what I really like about ESO, is its combat combined with its theory crafting, classes and build options that allow for a lot of self-expression and unique play styles. And now again, ESO's style of action combat is not for everyone. It definitely is different than something like Skyrim or Oblivion, for example, if you're more familiar with those Elder Scrolls game. The one frequent complaint I hear when ESO is compared to those single-player titles is that ESO combat just feels more floaty and less impactful, that you don't really see or feel the weight of your hits and your spells. And I think that's a fair criticism, but that for me, the fluidity of the combat, and especially all the options that we have for skills, the theory crafting more than makes up for that. Now, if you want to, you really can play ESO in first-person mode, both for exploring and questing and also for combat, though I wouldn't really recommend it for most combat situations, as you're going to need that peripheral vision for the MMO-style mechanics that this game has, like dodging projectiles, channeled attacks, red circles on the ground, all that stuff. That's kind of hard to do in first-person. PvP is even more difficult to do in first-person. But yeah, it can be done if you want to imitate that Skyrim experience, which I think the developers have recreated here, at least visually speaking. Now, another concern for many new players is that ESO uses active weapon swapping mechanics in combat, which means you can have active skills plotted on your skill bar for 2 different weapons, having different skills for each one. Now, this does expand the active skills that you can use in combat, 5 skills and 1 ultimate per weapon. So 10 skills and 2 ultimates in total, but you do have to swap to that particular weapon skill bar to use its skills. And I know some players just don't like that mechanic, or they don't want to do it, or physically, there might be some issues there. Now, you can still play ESO as a quote 1-bar build without weapon swapping, but obviously you're going to be limited to half the possible skills that other players are using. Still, you can make this work, and ESO even has item sets which support this. And I have builds here on the channel which go over this as well. So while weapon swapping may be a turnoff for some, it's not fully mandatory to play the game this way. Not everybody has to do it that way, so just keep that in mind. But if you're concerned about combat, then I would just repeat the same advice that I gave earlier, which is to try the base game of ESO for a few months to see if you like the combat style before investing any more time. That's because the combat here doesn't really change. From level 1 to max level, you simply are going to just unlock more skills and more passives and better gear along the way. So you should be able to tell pretty quickly if you like the combat in this game or not. Now, another potential plus or minus for you related to combat is going to be builds and theory crafting. With now 7 classes, hundreds of skills, and I think, over 500 different item sets in the game at this point, possibilities for creating your build in ESO are pretty much endless. Now, if you're a follower of this channel, I've created hundreds of build guides by now, and I'm very addicted to the variety of gameplay that ESO has. From just one class, you can play so many different ways, from solo to group gameplay, PvE or PvP focused, healer, tank, DPS. In 2024, ESO also added the new scribing system, which is a simpler version of spellcrafting from previous Elder Scrolls games, which adds customizable skills into the game as well, which every class can access. So there's just so many options here. ESO even has a built-in armory system, which lets players store and customize their own builds to instantly respec, which is pretty cool, and it's perfect for players who just want to have one character as their main and never play another class. Myself, on the other hand, I have my character slots maxed out with alternate characters, so I have, multiple characters for every class, which I build up and customize over time into different roles and play styles, which is how I prefer to play, which brings me to my next pro for ESO, and that's the leveling process. I personally love leveling up new characters in the Elder Scrolls Online. I still do this 10 years after I started playing the game. I think it's actually my favorite thing to do because the way that your character progresses, unlocking new abilities and play styles through the skill trees just feels really fun to me, and it's actually pretty fast too. The basic level cap in ESO is level 50, which you can honestly hit in just a week or maybe even a few days if you play a lot. Now, that doesn't mean your character is done at that point either, because after level 50, you then start getting into champion point levels, which unlock even more power for your character, and the maximum champion point level is 3,600. So yeah, you're not going to hit that level anytime soon. But what's really great about ESO is your champion point levels are account based and not character based. So if my main character is, let's say, CP level 500, and then I decide I want to create a new character, maybe from a different class, they will start at the basic level 1, but that new character can immediately go into the champion point system and use all 500 of those CP levels to get even more power at level 1, which is really fun, and it also makes it much easier and faster to level up that new character than the previous one. And by the way, if you're curious about how gear and levels interact, gear does drop for you at your current level, all the way up to the gear level cap at CP 160, so there really is no point in farming gear before champion point 160, as ideally you want all of your gear to be at that CP 160 cap to have the best stat bonuses. So I tend to just use, whatever random gear gear pieces I pick up before that level, because I'm just going to throw it away once my character reaches the cap and can use max level gear. Which leads us to our next con, I would say, for ESO, or just something to be aware of, and that's balancing. Now, I believe the devs have gotten much better at this over the past few years, but as an MMO with frequent content releases, there are going to be balance patches which come about, and these can change how your favorite class or your favorite sets are performing. Some skills get buffed while other skills get nerfed. Or even your favorite item set, which you farmed for hours to complete, may be different in the future patch because it didn't fit into the overall balance that the developers were trying to achieve. I don't think this is unique to ESO, and as an MMO player, you probably should expect some balance patches to hit any type of live service game, but just know that the quote meta or the flavor of the month build in ESO is pretty fragile, and it does tend to change basically every patch. So if you're interested in always having the best gear or always having the best build with the highest DPS, you will need to adapt to the game as it changes and updates by changing your skills, changing your gear or your play style, and maybe even changing your class. Of course, that's only for players who want to chase the meta, which I don't really recommend. I mean, yeah, you can maybe squeeze out 5% extra efficiency out of your build with a new quote meta, but to me, that's not really worth restarting everything. And for me too, and I think for the majority of ESO players, we just play the game as we want to anyways, so those meta shifts don't really affect us that much, though it is something that you need to be aware of. But that brings us to the next question, which is ESO pay to win? ESO does have an extensive cash shop with everything from basic consumables to quality of life upgrades and cosmetics to previously mentioned DLCs and chapters. Most of these items don't make ESO players more powerful directly, but instead provide convenience or utility. So while the crown store for ESO may not be blatantly pay to win, it's not great for players either, especially new players. That's because you might be prompted to purchase something on sale that you didn't know that you could already get for free in game without spending your real world money, like re-speccing your character, buying food or drink buffs, or getting experience scrolls to level up faster. In many cases, there are plenty of free options that just take a little bit more time to get, so be sure to do your research before buying anything, especially if you don't want to waste your crown allowance, which is included in the ESO Plus subscription, because you can use that to save up for some nice cosmetics, mounts, skins, and so on. But the crown store is also unfortunately where some players can quickly get sucked down the rabbit hole of loot crates, which are an ESO. That's because if you see something shiny that you want here, like an Apex mount, you could easily, drop a few $100s on random crates until you finally get the drop that you want. And yes, there are systems in place now that make things more, quote, fair, such as the crown gem system where you can trade in unwanted items for gems to eventually buy what you want, and the endeavor system, which lets you earn your way towards the same premium mounts and rewards but at a much slower pace doing in-game challenges. So microtransactions are a big part of ESO, whether you choose to participate in them or not, and it's just, again, something to be aware of. Now, whether or not paid DLC content is technically pay to win, I think that's another topic worth considering, because as we mentioned earlier, the best items tend to come from the new content, especially the new chapters and dungeons, which you have to pay for either with crowns or purchasing an ESO Plus subscription. The best example, though, that I can think of in ESO are mythic items, which are powerful one-piece item sets that give massive stat or performance bonuses of some type, but they do require at least a few DLCs to unlock those in most cases. So yeah, that is something to keep in mind as well. But I do want to mention the community here because yes, ESO is an online game and you can play it with other people if you want to do so. But for starters, if you like to play your Elder Scrolls game solo, as I said, as a single-player RPG, that's totally fine. ESO actually will give you hundreds of hours of content if you decide to play this way. However, some of the more advanced and more difficult content in ESO does require a group, and this is an MMO after all. So if you plan to play everything there is to do in this game, including the most challenging dungeons, trials, and even PvP, you want to start making friends and you want to join a guild as soon as possible. The ESO community is full of great people who will gladly, teach you how to improve your build or survive the most difficult dungeon mechanics, and there's even an in-game guild finder tool to help you get started, letting you search for the exact type of guild that you're looking for, and you can join more than one guild as well. ESO also has multiple in-game activity finder options, which make it easy to connect with groups of people to do specific content even easier. So as I said, one of the best things about ESO is the people that you can meet and the friendships you can make, so definitely make an effort to connect to the community. and I don't think you'll be disappointed. And if that's not for you, just continue to play solo as we talked about. Having said all that, I think 2025 could be a make or break year for the Elder Scrolls Online. For new players, as I've said, there's literally hundreds of hours of content to enjoy here, and you can do so at a pretty low cost barrier to entry, basically $20 or less, just to get started. So for new players checking out ESO in 2025, it's very low risk and there's a lot of upside. For returning players, however, we really don't know quite yet just how 2025 is going to turn out. We know that we won't have, the standard lead up and reveal of a big chapter expansion, which is definitely going to feel a lot different. We know we'll be seeing some new seasonal content offerings, smaller content offerings, possibly new dungeons in Q1, probably new story content to follow, and maybe some new systems. Will it make you want to return to the game? We don't know yet, but the devs could pull off something completely surprising here, and I personally can't wait to see what's coming next. Everybody, one of the best features of HTM is our YouTube membership community, where you can unlock some really amazing perks for supporting the channel. Our level 2 membership called the Elite Squad is where I recommend you start, because this unlocks tons of members only builds and guides that you won't see anywhere else on YouTube. That's because each of our members only builds are handcrafted to be completely unique, off meta, and give you access to something really fun, powerful, and easy to play. For example, the solo Death Knight build focuses on insane self-healing and resource regeneration available to the Necro class in ESO, while the Unkillable Arcanist build focuses on channeled effects that buff your damage mitigation and shields for easy survival. We have the Unkillable Werewolf build focused on pure heavy attack carnage, and one of my favorites, a no-class skills Barbarian build, which focuses completely on two-handed abilities and is now supplemented with scribing skills, so it feels like a completely new class of its own. And these are just some examples of all the unique content on offer, and we're always updating and adding to this list every month. Plus, each members only build also comes with an exclusive written guide only for channel members to make these even easier for you to build yourself. But of course, that's not all you get. We also have loyalty badges, which will appear next to your name in YouTube, plus early access to videos and access to our members-only Discord, so you can ask questions and chat with myself and other players in our community. So if that sounds good to you, just click on that join button right beneath my video in YouTube to get started, and make sure to select the Elite Squad option to unlock those exclusive videos. Or go to hacktheminotaur.com/members for more information and to see the full list of absolutely everything you can unlock. We've even added some members-only guides recently, like my favorite hidden grind spots for ESO, so there is a truckload of content for you to explore once you sign up. Finally, I just want to say a quick thank you for supporting me and the HTM community. YouTube pays gaming creators only pennies when it comes to running ads on our videos, so it's channel members like you that actually keep this channel going now and into the future. Believe me, your support is greatly appreciated. So welcome to the squad, and I will see you around in the next video.